There is a specific kind of quiet that only exists in places built for suffering, long after the lights go out. Most people never have to hear the way an empty hospital breathes at 3 in the morning. They never have to sit in a flickering security booth at the end of a forgotten dirt road in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, listening to the static on a dead radio. You take a job like this because the bank is calling every day and you are out of options. You tell yourself the isolation is just a minor inconvenience for a paycheck that will keep a roof over your head. But by the time you reach rule number 5 on the supervisor's handwritten list, that desperate optimism always rots into pure, suffocating dread. Mark was 24, flat broke, and entirely convinced that monsters were just stories told to sell movie tickets. He took the graveyard shift at Blackwood Memorial because the county had practically abandoned the facility, and the pay was triple the local average. The day shift guy, a hollow-eyed man named Miller, handed over the keys without making eye contact. Miller looked like a guy who hadn't slept a full night in a decade, his hands shaking as he buttoned his coat to leave. He shoved a crumpled piece of yellow legal paper across the stained linoleum desk and told Mark to memorize it before midnight. Mark just laughed it off as a bad hazing joke, tossing the paper next to his lukewarm coffee without a second thought. The first few hours of the shift were exactly the kind of mind-numbing boredom you expect from an empty building. Mark spent his time pacing the main lobby, listening to the squeak of his cheap rubber soles echoing off the pale green tiles. The hospital was a relic from the late 70s, all harsh angles and heavy fire doors that slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. Outside the glass double doors, the tree line was a solid wall of black against the moonless sky. He checked his phone every 10 minutes, but the signal had died completely the moment he turned off the main highway. The absolute isolation of the place was starting to settle heavy on his shoulders, making the stifling air feel even thicker. Around 11, the silence broke when the old radiator pipe started to groan and hiss deep in the walls. Mark walked back into the tiny security office to grab his jacket, shivering as a sudden, biting draft rolled through the corridor. That was when his eyes finally caught the bold, frantic handwriting on the yellow legal pad Miller had left behind. The ink was smudged in places, as if the guy had been sweating profusely while dragging the pen across the page. Rule number 1 simply stated that the basement elevator must always remain locked on the ground floor after sundown. Rule number 2 warned him to ignore any crying sounds coming from the pediatric ward on the 3rd floor, because there were no children left in the building. Mark let out a nervous chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck, as he read through the increasingly bizarre instructions. Rule number 3 was oddly specific, telling him to close his eyes and count to 10 if the fluorescent lights in the south wing turned completely red. He figured Miller was just a sadistic jerk trying to mess with the new guy's head to pass the time. People in these dead-end towns always had weird ways of entertaining themselves at the expense of outsiders. He almost crumpled the paper up to throw it in the trash bin, but something about the frantic loops in the handwriting made him stop. The sheer desperation etched into those words felt entirely too real for a simple prank. Looking back, it is completely obvious that Miller knew exactly what lived in the dark corners of that hospital. The old supervisor was not a victim of circumstance, but a man who kept his own skin safe by keeping the night desk occupied by someone else. He needed a warm body in that chair, someone young and desperate enough to ignore the glaring warning signs. Every new guard was just meat fed into a very quiet, very efficient machine that no one in town ever dared to talk about. Mark was just the latest fool to trade his safety for a few extra dollars an hour in a place that God had clearly forgotten. If he had realized that truth just an hour earlier, he could have walked out to his car and never looked back. By midnight, the heavy atmosphere in the lobby shifted from simply boring to actively oppressive. A foul smell began to drift through the ventilation shafts, something like old copper and rotting wet wood. Mark pulled his collar up over his nose, grabbing his heavy metal flashlight as he decided to investigate the source of the stench. He stepped out of the office and paused, swearing he could hear a faint, wet, dragging noise coming from the end of the east corridor. The sound was slow and deliberate, scraping against the linoleum in a rhythmic pattern that made his stomach drop. He looked down at the yellow paper still clutched in his left hand, his eyes scanning wildly for rule number 4. Rule number 4 advised the guard to never shine a light directly at anything moving in the east corridor. Mark felt his thumb trembling against the power button of his heavy flashlight, fighting every natural instinct to illuminate the suffocating darkness ahead. The wet, dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, rattling breath that echoed off the empty patient room doors. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs as he slowly backed away, retreating toward the fragile safety of the security booth. He realized with sickening clarity that the stories about this place were not just local urban legends designed to scare teenagers. He bumped into the desk, his shaking fingers tracing the paper down to rule number 5, as the shadow in the hall finally stepped into the dim emergency lighting. Whatever was dragging itself out of the suffocating darkness of the east corridor did not belong anywhere in the natural world. It moved in sharp, violent, jagged spasms, like a broken wooden marionette with half its strings cut, dragging one dead limb behind it. Mark stood completely frozen behind the thin plywood desk, his terrified mind desperately trying to categorize the looming shape into something safe and rational. He wanted to believe it was just an unfortunate trespasser, a sick animal from the woods, or some elaborate prank played by the bored locals. But a human body simply does not bend at those impossible angles, and no living animal on earth breathes with that wet, hollow, rattling sound. The rupture of his logic was absolute and immediate, shattering every comforting lie he had ever told himself about what hides in the dark. The flickering emergency lights overhead buzzed erratically, casting long, deeply distorted shadows across the pale green tiles as the thing lurched ever closer. It was incredibly tall, scraping its twisted head against the drop ceiling with a sickening noise of peeling paint and scratching bone. Mark felt his lungs violently seize up in his chest, his vision tunneling as pure, unfiltered adrenaline flooded his paralyzed, terrified system. He suddenly realized he was gripping the heavy metal flashlight so tightly that his knuckles were stark white and completely drained of blood. He desperately wanted to run for the glass double doors, to burst out into the freezing night air and disappear deep into the surrounding trees. But his legs felt like they had been poured full of wet cement, anchoring him securely to the stained and rotting linoleum floor. The wet, heavy, dragging sound suddenly stopped, and the oppressive silence that followed was somehow infinitely worse than the terrifying noise. The shape was standing perfectly still just past the lobby entrance, its head tilted toward the desk at an impossible, completely broken angle. Mark forced his watering eyes down to the crumpled yellow legal pad, blindly tracing the frantic handwriting until he reached rule number 5. The dark ink was almost violently pressed into the cheap paper, reading that if it stops moving, lock the door and pray it does not hear you breathe. He realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that Miller had probably sat in this exact chair, staring at this exact horrifying shape. The older man had only survived by learning the terrible, bloody rhythm of this place, leaving these desperate instructions behind to keep himself safe. With agonizing, heartbreaking slowness, Mark lowered his trembling left hand and clicked the heavy brass lock on the office door firmly into place. The sharp metallic click echoed like a massive gunshot in the dead, suffocating quiet of the empty hospital lobby. He instantly dropped to his hands and knees, scrambling clumsily under the cheap desk and curling his tall frame into a tight, desperate ball. The stale air in the tiny security booth felt suddenly and inexplicably freezing, his terrified breath coming out in rapid, shallow, white puffs of mist. He clamped both hands firmly over his own mouth, biting down hard on his knuckles to muffle the sound of his own terrified sobbing. Every single fiber of his being was entirely focused on the heavy, dragging footsteps that slowly and methodically resumed their approach toward his fragile sanctuary. A massive, distorted shadow fell heavily over the frosted glass of the office door, completely blocking out the faint ambient lighting from the main hallway. Mark pressed his shaking back flat against the cold metal of the rusted filing cabinet, squeezing his eyes shut as tightly as he physically could. He heard a wet, heavy thump against the wooden doorframe, followed by the highly distinct sound of something sniffing aggressively at the gap near the floor. It smelled strongly like a flooded basement, mixed with old, rotting blood, a deeply sickening odor that immediately coated the back of his dry throat. He could hear it breathing just a few inches away, a terrible, rattling wheeze that sounded like ancient lungs slowly filling with dirty, freezing water. He knew with absolute certainty that if that brass doorknob turned, his life would violently end right there under a cheap desk in the middle of nowhere. The heavy shadow loomed outside the door for what felt like an absolute eternity, viciously testing the absolute limits of Mark's crumbling sanity. It slowly dragged a heavy, unseen claw down the frosted safety glass, producing a high, horrible screeching noise that vibrated right through his jaw. He silently prayed to a God he had not spoken to since his childhood, desperately begging for the morning light to break over the trees just this once. But the cheap plastic clock on the wall above him was hopelessly stuck at 3 in the morning, serving as a mocking reminder of his endless shift. The dark shape eventually shifted its immense weight away from the thin door, the wet, dragging sound slowly retreating back down the pitch-black corridor. Mark did not dare to move a single cramped muscle, knowing entirely well that whatever it was could easily be waiting in silence just out of his sight. That kind of suffocating, deeply isolating terror permanently changes a person, and I know some of you listening to my voice right now understand exactly how that feels. You might be lying in your bed tonight, staring into the pitch-black corner of your room, silently wondering what might be hiding just out of your sight. If you ever find yourself working a lonely graveyard shift in a place that feels deeply and inherently wrong, you absolutely need a desperate backup plan. I cannot stress this warning enough. You have to know exactly what to do when the lights finally go out and the normal rules break down completely. Go down to the pinned comment right now, before this video ends, and memorize the exact survival protocol I left down there for you. It might just be the one critical thing that keeps you breathing until the morning sun finally breaks over the horizon to save you. Mark stayed huddled under the desk for 2 full hours after the scratching stopped. His muscles screamed in agonizing protest, cramping up so severely that he could barely feel his own feet inside his cheap boots. He slowly uncurled his stiff body, keeping his head well below the level of the frosted glass window of the office door. The air in the security booth still carried that rotting metallic stench, sticking to the back of his throat like a thick layer of grease. He knew he could not stay in that tiny room forever, especially since the yellow notepad explicitly detailed what happened if he did. Rule number 6 was written in entirely capitalized letters, stating that the guard must complete a floor patrol before 4 in the morning. He grabbed the heavy metal flashlight, wrapping his numb fingers tightly around the cold handle to stop them from shaking so violently. Mark slowly unlocked the office door, wincing internally as the heavy brass latch clicked loudly in the oppressive silence of the lobby. He stepped out into the pale green hallway, keeping his back pressed firmly against the cold, peeling wallpaper to avoid the center of the corridor. The drop ceiling overhead groaned under the weight of the old building, a sound that made him jump wildly at every single creak. He forced himself to walk forward with agonizing slowness, his cheap rubber soles sliding quietly over the dirty linoleum tiles. His eyes constantly darted toward the dark corners, desperately searching for any sign of that towering, broken shape returning from the darkness. The instructions on the yellow notepad burned clearly in his mind, dictating his every single move as he navigated the abandoned hospital wings. He reached the heavy fire doors of the surgical ward, pushing them open with his shoulder, while strictly keeping his flashlight pointed down at the floor. Rule number 7 demanded that he never look into the observation windows of the operating rooms, regardless of what he heard tapping on the glass. As he walked past the 3rd door, a frantic, rapid tapping noise started up right next to his left ear. He clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached, staring intensely at his own dusty boots and refusing to break his gaze away. The sound escalated into a violent pounding, as if someone inside was desperately trying to smash through the thick, reinforced glass to reach him. Mark swallowed down the rising bile in his throat, accelerating his pace just enough to escape the noise without breaking into an outright run. Running was specifically forbidden in rule number 8, because sudden, fast movements apparently triggered whatever the hell hunted in these endless dark halls. The frantic pounding abruptly stopped the exact second he crossed the threshold out of the surgical ward and into the sterile white stairwell. He collapsed heavily against the cold concrete wall, gasping for the stale, dusty air as his chest heaved with completely unmanaged panic. The horrifying reality of his situation washed over him again, realizing that Miller had absolutely memorized this terrifying routine to survive his own shifts. The older supervisor had perfectly mapped out the behaviors of this place, using new guards like Mark to keep the things in the dark occupied. He pushed himself off the concrete wall, knowing he still had to check the basement elevator before the clock hit 5. The descent down the concrete stairs felt like walking straight into a deep, freezing grave that was actively waiting to swallow him whole. When he reached the bottom landing, the heavy metal door to the basement level was already hanging slightly open on its rusted hinges. A low, wet, gurgling sound echoed from the pitch-black space beyond, followed by the heavy, deliberate scraping of a deformed limb dragging across concrete. Mark immediately remembered the very first rule on Miller's list, stating that the basement elevator must never be called up after sundown. Whatever was down there was currently trying to force the rusted elevator doors open with terrible, raw, physical strength. He dropped to his knees in the freezing stairwell, crawling slowly toward the heavy door to pull it shut without making a single sound. His trembling fingers grabbed the rusted handle, pulling it toward him inch by terrifying inch as the gurgling sound inside grew much louder. The gap narrowed just as a long, pale, deeply bruised hand violently slapped down onto the concrete floor just inside the basement threshold. Mark aggressively slammed the heavy door shut, trapping the thick, unnatural fingers in the heavy metal frame with a sickening crunch of breaking bone. He threw his entire body weight against the door, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place as a deafening, inhuman shriek vibrated through the floorboards. He collapsed onto the cold stairs, his entire body shaking uncontrollably as he realized he still had one more hour before the sun came up. The final hour before dawn dragged on like a slow, agonizing death march in that freezing concrete stairwell. Mark sat curled up against the locked basement door, listening to the heavy, wet breathing on the other side slowly fade away into the depths of the building. His entire body was numb from the bitter cold, his hands covered in dried blood from gripping his own fingernails entirely too tightly. He watched the tiny, cracked screen of his dead phone, entirely unable to check the exact time, but desperately knowing the morning light had to be coming soon. There was no heroic sense of victory or overwhelming relief washing over him in those intensely quiet moments. He just felt incredibly hollow, completely stripped of whatever basic innocence he had brought with him into that hospital just a few hours earlier. When the first dull rays of morning light finally filtered through the high, dirty windows of the stairwell, the heavy atmosphere in the building completely shattered. The oppressive, rotting smell that had aggressively choked the hallways all night vanished entirely, cleanly replaced by the mundane scent of old dust and cheap floor wax. Mark slowly pushed himself up from the cold concrete floor, his stiff joints popping loudly in the dead silence as he forced his exhausted legs to carry his weight. He walked back up through the sterile white corridors without bothering to check the dark corners or muffle his incredibly heavy footsteps. The hospital looked entirely normal in the pale daylight, standing quietly as just a sad, decaying pile of bricks and glass sitting silently in the woods. He stumbled back into the main lobby, tossing his heavy metal flashlight onto the cheap wooden desk without giving a single glance back at the east hallway. The glass double doors hissed open right at 6 in the morning, letting in a sudden rush of freezing morning air as Miller casually walked through the entrance. The older man looked exactly the same as he did the night before, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact as he carried a steaming paper cup of cheap coffee. Miller stopped completely dead in his tracks when he finally saw Mark standing behind the desk, his exhausted eyes widening just a fraction of an inch in genuine shock. He clearly had not expected to see the kid breathing this morning, completely assuming the county would just have to clean out another empty locker before noon. Mark stared right back at him, clearly seeing the deep, pathetic guilt written all over the older supervisor's pale, deeply lined face. He suddenly understood with absolute clarity that Miller was not a victim at all, but the actual monster who kept this terrible ecosystem perfectly fed and balanced. Mark did not throw a violent punch, and he certainly did not scream at the miserable old man standing silently in the hospital lobby. He just slowly reached into his heavy jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled yellow legal pad, and placed it very gently on the stained linoleum counter. Miller looked down at his own frantic handwriting, his tense jaw tightening slightly as he completely failed to find a single word of explanation or hollow apology. Mark walked slowly right past him, pushing heavily through the thick glass doors and stepping out into the absolute freezing clarity of the morning air. He climbed into his beat-up sedan, his freezing hands shaking violently as he forced the key into the ignition and brought the loud engine to life. He drove away down that forgotten dirt road without ever looking in the rearview mirror, desperately wanting to put 1,000 miles between himself and that awful place. You can physically drive away from a cursed place like Blackwood Memorial, but you can never actually leave the heavy darkness completely behind you. It has been 3 long years since Mark worked that single night shift, and he still cannot sleep without leaving every single light on in his small apartment. He quit taking jobs that required him to work anywhere past sundown, finally settling for a noisy daytime construction gig that keeps him firmly in the bright daylight. But every single time he hears the heavy pipes groan in his own building, his chest instantly tightens up with that exact same paralyzing, suffocating terror. He constantly catches himself nervously counting the fluorescent lights in crowded grocery stores, desperately praying they never flicker and turn a deep, bloody red. The physical escape was perfectly successful that morning, but his fractured mind is still sitting curled up under a cheap wooden desk in the middle of nowhere. The absolute saddest part of the whole terrible story is not just what actually breathes in the deep shadows of that abandoned county hospital. It is the deeply terrifying realization that somewhere out there right now, a desperate kid is answering a classified ad that promises great pay for very easy hours. A miserable, broken old man exactly like Miller is going to hand them a set of heavy brass keys and a freshly written piece of yellow paper. They are going to laugh the whole thing off as a bad local joke, completely blind to the terrifying fact that they are just fresh meat for something they cannot even comprehend. So, if you ever find yourself eagerly taking a job where the rules feel too weird and the air feels way too heavy, just walk away immediately. Because if you stubbornly stay to find out exactly why the basement elevator is permanently locked, you might never actually get the chance to clock out.